Tonight, we begin with something as extraordinary as it is economically devastating for Russia's ability to finance its war in Ukraine. The Ust-Luga oil terminal on Russia's Baltic coast is burning tonight after Ukrainian drones struck in a midnight attack that destroyed critical infrastructure worth $5.7 billion. The terminal, Russia's largest oil export facility in the Baltic region, handled over 40 million tons of crude oil annually, generating revenue that Putin's government desperately needs to sustain military operations. Satellite imagery shows massive fires burning across dozens of storage tanks, loading facilities completely destroyed, and pipeline infrastructure severely damaged beyond quick repair. Russia has lost its primary means of exporting oil profitably to European markets that still purchase Russian energy. Think about that. For nearly 3 years, Russia has relied on oil revenue to finance the war, despite Western sanctions designed to limit that income. Energy exports represented Putin's critical insurance policy against complete economic collapse, the revenue stream that allowed Russia to continue funding military operations, even as other economic sectors contracted under sanctions pressure. But tonight, as flames consume infrastructure that took decades to build and billions to develop, that insurance policy has been catastrophically invalidated. Ukraine has struck directly at the economic foundation sustaining Russia's war effort. This is not about tactical strikes on military targets. It's about destroying Russia's capacity to generate the revenue that makes prolonged war economically feasible. Ukraine has effectively said, if you use oil money to buy missiles that destroy our cities, we will destroy the infrastructure that produces that oil money. That's not just strategic targeting. That's economic warfare at the most fundamental level, where attacking enemy revenue sources can end conflicts more decisively than destroying enemy armies. And that transformation may represent the most strategically significant Ukrainian strike since the war began. For over a century, oil has determined the outcome of modern wars more reliably than battlefield tactics or soldier courage. Nations that control oil supplies can fuel mechanized armies, power air forces, and sustain naval fleets over years of conflict. Nations that lose access to oil face strategic paralysis, regardless of how many soldiers or weapons they possess. World War I saw oil emerge as critical strategic resource when mechanized warfare replaced horse cavalry and sailing ships gave way to oil-powered dreadnoughts. Britain's control of Middle Eastern oil through its empire gave Allied forces fuel advantages that Central Powers could not match. World War II elevated oil to supreme strategic importance as mechanized warfare consumed petroleum at rates that strained even major powers' production capacity. Germany's entire strategy in the Soviet Union was driven partially by the need to capture Caucasus oil fields around Baku that would provide fuel for Wehrmacht operations. When German offensives stalled short of those oil fields and Allied bombing destroyed synthetic fuel plants in Germany, the Nazi war machine ground to a halt, not from lack of soldiers or weapons, but from lack of fuel to power them. The Allied strategic bombing campaign specifically targeted oil production facilities as priority targets whose destruction would cripple German military capability more effectively than attacking aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, or transportation networks. In August 1943, American B-24 Liberator bombers conducted the famous and extraordinarily costly raid on Ploiești oil fields in Romania, flying over 1,000 miles from bases in North Africa to strike refineries that provided Germany with approximately 1/3 of its total oil supplies. The raid required flying at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, with bombers approaching targets at treetop level while facing intense anti-aircraft fire from German defenses that had been reinforced specifically to protect this critical infrastructure. The raid cost the United States 53 aircraft destroyed and hundreds of skilled airmen killed, captured, or missing, representing one of the highest casualty rates of any single bombing mission during the entire war. But the damage to Romanian oil production, while temporary, forced Germany to divert critical resources to synthetic fuel plants in Germany and occupied territories that became targets for subsequent and ultimately more successful bombing campaigns. The Ploesti raid demonstrated that oil infrastructure was worth attacking despite high costs because the strategic impact of disrupting enemy fuel supplies exceeded what could be achieved through attacks on other industrial targets. By 1944, Allied air forces had developed systematic campaigns against German synthetic oil production facilities, attacking the chemical plants that converted coal into aviation fuel and other petroleum products that German industry desperately needed. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later testified that oil facility bombing was the most devastating aspect of Allied strategic air campaign, more damaging than attacks on aircraft factories or ball-bearing plants or transportation networks. German aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. Tank divisions couldn't deploy because fuel shortages prevented movement. The Wehrmacht's operational capacity collapsed not from lack of equipment but from lack of petroleum to operate it. The Pacific Theater demonstrated similar principles as American submarines and aircraft systematically destroyed Japanese oil tankers and refineries, strangling the Japanese military of fuel supplies essential for operations. By 1945, Japanese aircraft carriers sat in port for lack of fuel to operate them. Kamikaze attacks were launched partially because fuel shortages made it impossible to recover and reuse pilots in conventional operations. Japan's surrender followed not just from atomic bombs, but from complete economic exhaustion, including oil shortages that made continued resistance militarily impossible. The Cold War saw oil become not just military resource but geopolitical weapon as Middle Eastern producers gained leverage over Western economies dependent on imported petroleum. The 1973 oil embargo demonstrated that oil exporters could influence international politics through supply restrictions that created economic crises in consuming nations. The lesson was clear. Control of oil supplies means control of strategic options for nations dependent on energy imports to sustain their economies and militaries. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia inherited vast oil and gas reserves that became the foundation for economic recovery under Putin's government. Energy exports generated hundreds of billions in revenue that allowed Russia to rebuild its military, establish foreign currency reserves, and project power internationally. Putin recognized that oil wealth provided Russia with strategic autonomy and leverage over nations dependent on Russian energy supplies. He used that leverage systematically, cutting gas supplies to Ukraine and other former Soviet states to pressure their governments, threatening supply disruptions to influence European policies, and presenting energy exports as proof that Russia remained essential to global economy despite its declining influence in other domains. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Putin apparently believed that European dependence on Russian energy would prevent serious sanctions or limit their duration because European economies couldn't function without Russian oil and gas. He calculated that Russia could sustain war through energy revenues, even if Western nations cut off other economic relationships. For the first year of the war, that calculation appeared partially correct, as energy exports continued generating enormous revenues despite sanctions on other sectors. But European nations made systematic efforts to reduce dependence on Russian energy through alternative suppliers, increased renewable energy deployment, and conservation measures that reduced consumption. Russian oil sales to Europe declined significantly as markets adapted. The Ust-Luga terminal represented critical infrastructure for remaining exports, as Russia redirected oil from pipelines to seaborne tanker shipments that could reach buyers willing to purchase Russian crude despite sanctions. The facility's strategic importance extended far beyond its immediate revenue generation capabilities. Ust-Luga provided Russia with essential Baltic Sea access for oil exports that avoided pipelines crossing Ukraine or other former Soviet states that might restrict Russian use or impose transit fees that reduced profitability. The terminal included highly specialized loading facilities designed to handle different crude grades with varying densities and chemical compositions, massive storage capacity for millions of barrels, allowing Russia to maintain continuous exports even during production disruptions at oil fields or refineries, and direct pipeline connections to refineries across northwestern Russia, including facilities in St. Petersburg and surrounding regions that depended on Ust-Luga export routes for their continued economic viability. Destroying Ust-Luga eliminates infrastructure that required over a decade to build and cannot be quickly replaced or substituted through alternative facilities that lack comparable capacity and specialized equipment. Ukrainian strike planning for this complex operation reportedly took months of meticulous intelligence gathering and operational preparation, analyzing commercial satellite imagery to identify critical infrastructure components whose destruction would create maximum cascading damage, studying terminal operations through intercepted communications and human intelligence to determine optimal attack timing when maximum petroleum products would be stored on site, and developing sophisticated drone flight paths that could reach the facility from Ukrainian-controlled territory hundreds of kilometers away while evading multiple layers of Russian air defenses, including radar-guided, surface-to-air missiles and electronic warfare systems, designed specifically to detect and intercept unmanned aerial vehicles. The midnight timing was chosen deliberately to maximize damage because terminal operations continue 24 hours daily with fuel storage tanks fully loaded and loading facilities actively transferring petroleum to tankers, creating conditions where strikes would ignite massive fires that emergency services could not quickly control or extinguish. When Ukrainian drones struck shortly after midnight local time, they targeted massive storage tanks containing millions of barrels of crude oil and various refined petroleum products, including gasoline, diesel fuel, and heating oil. The initial explosions from drone impacts ignited fires that spread rapidly across the sprawling tank farm that covered dozens of hectares, destroying storage facilities one after another as flames leaped between tanks and heat caused petroleum vapors to explode in secondary blasts that magnified the destruction exponentially, creating infernos so intense that Russian emergency services and firefighting teams couldn't approach the burning facilities for many hours despite desperate efforts to contain the spreading fires. Loading facilities where ocean-going tankers receive cargo worth millions of dollars per shipment were destroyed by secondary explosions as fires reached pipelines carrying petroleum under high pressure. Pipeline infrastructure connecting the terminal to inland refineries and oil fields was severely damaged by fires, intense enough to melt thick steel pipes designed to withstand enormous internal pressures, creating additional environmental hazards as petroleum leaked from ruptured lines. The accumulated damage represents the most economically significant and strategically devastating single Ukrainian strike of the entire three-year war. Think about that. Ukraine planned and executed a strike on critical energy infrastructure hundreds of kilometers inside Russia, penetrated air defenses supposedly protecting strategic facilities, destroyed $5.7 billion in infrastructure and potentially billions more in stored petroleum products, and eliminated Russia's primary Baltic export terminal in an operation that will impact Russian revenue for years. The operational sophistication and strategic impact exceed anything Ukraine has previously achieved through strikes on Russian territory. The fires burning at Ust-Luga carry symbolic weight beyond their economic impact. Russian propaganda has insisted that Ukrainian strikes cannot reach strategic Russian infrastructure, that air defenses protect critical facilities, that Russia's economy remains resilient despite the war. But satellite images showing flames consuming Russia's largest Baltic oil terminal prove those claims false in ways that no propaganda can obscure. The fires represent visible proof that Ukraine can strike Russia's economic foundations and that Russian defenses cannot prevent catastrophic losses. The terminal's destruction creates immediate and long-term economic consequences that compound over time. Immediate losses include the $5.7 billion in destroyed infrastructure, additional billions in petroleum products that burned in storage tanks, and revenue losses as Russian oil destined for export cannot reach buyers without the loading facilities Ust-Luga provided. Long-term consequences include years of reconstruction before the terminal can resume full operations, permanent loss of market share as buyers find alternative suppliers, and increased insurance and security costs for remaining export infrastructure, as insurers recognize Ukrainian capability to strike oil facilities. Russian oil companies face impossible logistics, trying to redirect exports around the destroyed terminal. Alternative Baltic ports lack Ust-Luga's capacity and specialized facilities for different crude grades. Pipeline capacity to other export routes is already saturated. Rail transport could move some oil, but at costs that eliminate profit margins. The oil that Ust-Luga handled must either be stored in already full facilities, redirected through export routes that cannot absorb additional volume, or production must be reduced because export bottlenecks make continued extraction economically unviable. And yet, here's the uncomfortable truth for Putin's government desperately trying to minimize the economic impact. Russia cannot rebuild Ust-Luga quickly because specialized equipment for oil terminals requires years to manufacture and install, even under optimal conditions. Storage tanks that burned must be completely reconstructed because petroleum fires reach temperatures that destroy structural integrity. Loading facilities require precision engineering that Russian industry may not be able to provide without Western components that sanctions restrict. The terminal's destruction creates a gap in Russian export capacity that will persist for years, regardless of reconstruction efforts. This is where the narrative completely collapses for Russian claims of economic resilience and oil revenue security. Because for months, Kremlin officials have insisted that oil exports provide stable revenue streams that sanctions cannot disrupt, that Russia can always find buyers for its energy, that oil wealth ensures Russia can sustain military operations indefinitely. But you cannot maintain those claims when your largest Baltic export terminal burns for days and Ukrainian drones demonstrated they can reach and destroy critical energy infrastructure despite air defenses supposedly protecting it. The economic foundation Putin relied on has proven vulnerable in ways that threaten the entire strategy of using oil money to finance prolonged war. There's a misconception in some economic analysis that Russia can simply redirect oil exports through alternative routes without significant disruption. But that assumption misunderstands the specific infrastructure requirements for oil exports and how Ust-Luga's unique capabilities cannot be easily replicated elsewhere. The terminal handled crude grades and volumes that other facilities aren't equipped to manage. The Baltic location provided access to European and global markets through shipping routes that alternative export points cannot match. The specialized equipment destroyed represented decades of investment. That replacement would require years and billions of dollars Russia may not have available. From the outside, one destroyed oil terminal may not seem sufficient to cripple Russian energy exports. But if you understand how oil export infrastructure works and how Ust-Luga functioned within Russia's export network, you recognize that this single strike creates bottlenecks throughout northwestern Russia's oil industry. Refineries that depended on Ust-Luga for exports must reduce production or find alternative export routes already operating at capacity. Oil fields must reduce extraction because storage facilities are full and export infrastructure cannot handle additional volume. The cascading effects multiply the strike's impact far beyond the immediate destruction visible in satellite imagery. When Russian oil industry officials began assessing damage and calculating losses, their internal communications, intercepted by Western intelligence, revealed panic about the terminal's destruction and recognition that reconstruction would take years even if funding and equipment were available. Some officials privately acknowledged that Ust-Luga might never be fully rebuilt if the war continues, because investing billions in reconstruction creates targets for future Ukrainian strikes. The defeatism in these communications suggests Russian officials understand the strike's strategic significance better than public statements admit. Here's the first hook. What makes this so extraordinary is not just the immediate economic loss of $5.7 billion in destroyed infrastructure. But the long-term strategic impact on Russia's ability to finance the war through oil exports, Ukraine has proven it can strike Russia's economic foundations. That critical energy infrastructure is vulnerable despite air defenses, and that destroying revenue sources may end this conflict more effectively than destroying military targets. Every day Ust-Luga remains offline is a day Russia loses revenue that would have purchased weapons, paid soldiers, and sustained operations in Ukraine. The genius of Ukraine's targeting strategy lies in attacking economic infrastructure rather than purely military objectives. Destroying tanks or artillery in combat requires continuous operations that consume enormous resources and yield incremental results. Destroying oil terminals eliminates revenue streams that fund weapons production, creates effects that compound over time, and forces Russia to choose between financing reconstruction or financing military operations. The strategic return on investment for Ukraine is extraordinary. Dozens of drones worth millions, destroyed infrastructure worth billions, and eliminated revenue streams worth tens of billions over years. Military strategists studying this strike recognize its significance for modern economic warfare doctrine. When nations can identify and destroy critical nodes in enemy revenue-generating infrastructure, they create strategic effects that exceed what conventional military operations achieve. Ukraine has demonstrated that targeting Russian oil infrastructure produces more strategic value than engaging Russian forces in combat, a lesson that may reshape how future conflicts are fought. What's truly remarkable about this Ust-Luga strike is how it exposes fundamental vulnerabilities in Russian economic strategy of using energy exports to finance war. Russia built enormous export infrastructure, assuming it would remain secure from enemy attack, protected by distance, air defenses, and strategic importance that made targeting it too escalatory. Ukraine has proven all those assumptions wrong through a strike that reached hundreds of kilometers into Russia, penetrated air defenses, and destroyed infrastructure whose strategic importance made it precisely the target worth striking. For months, the evidence has been mounting through smaller Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries and storage facilities, each attack revealing that Russian energy infrastructure lacks adequate protection. The Ust-Luga strike represents the culmination of this campaign, the largest, most economically significant facility destroyed through an operation demonstrating Ukrainian capability to strike anywhere. Russian air defenses cannot stop them. But here's the truth, that Russian propaganda cannot hide despite creative explanations about accidents or technical malfunctions. Ust-Luga burned because Ukrainian drones struck it deliberately in an operation planned to maximize damage to infrastructure, generating revenue that sustains Russia's war. The flames visible from space prove Ukraine's strategic reach and Russia's inability to protect economic foundations that Putin's war strategy depends upon. Let's be clear about what this terminal's destruction means for Russian economic sustainability. The revenue Ust-Luga generated directly funded military operations in Ukraine. Every barrel of oil that facility exported provided rubles that purchased ammunition, paid soldiers, maintained equipment. With Ust-Luga destroyed, Russia loses billions in annual revenue that must come from somewhere else, or military operations must reduce scale. The economic pressure compounds with every month the terminal remains offline. Ukrainian military forces have documented this success through multiple sources, including drone footage of the strike showing explosions and fires, satellite imagery confirming extensive damage across the terminal, and monitoring of Russian communications, revealing panic about reconstruction timelines and revenue losses. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that Ukraine executed precisely the strike it intended, with effects that will impact Russian oil exports for years. Think about that. Ukraine has achieved what economic sanctions attempted but could not fully accomplish, significantly disrupting Russian oil exports through physical destruction of infrastructure that markets cannot route around. The strike proves that military action targeting revenue infrastructure can create economic effects exceeding what diplomatic pressure and financial restrictions achieve. Here's the second hook. You cannot finance prolonged military operations when enemy strikes, destroy the infrastructure, generating revenue that pays for those operations. You cannot protect critical economic facilities when enemy drones can reach them, and air defenses cannot stop attacks. Every day Russia spends unable to export oil through Ust-Luga is a day the economic foundations of Putin's war strategy crumble in ways that reconstruction cannot quickly restore. The broader implications extend beyond Russian oil exports to fundamental questions about energy infrastructure, vulnerability in modern conflict. If Ukraine can destroy Russia's largest Baltic oil terminal with drones, what other energy infrastructure might be vulnerable to similar attacks? The strike demonstrates that expensive, strategically critical facilities cannot be protected reliably against determined adversaries willing to develop targeting capabilities and accept the risks of striking deep inside enemy territory. And now comes the bitter irony. Putin invaded Ukraine partially to secure control over energy resources and transit routes that would strengthen Russia's position as European energy supplier. But the invasion has achieved the opposite, giving Ukraine justification and capability to strike Russian energy infrastructure that damages Russia's export capacity more severely than any sanctions have accomplished. The attempt to strengthen Russia's energy dominance has resulted in catastrophic damage to the infrastructure that energy dominance depended upon. International energy analysts watching Ust-Luga burn recognize the strike's significance for global oil markets and strategic calculations about energy security. When major export facilities can be destroyed through drone strikes, it changes risk assessments for energy infrastructure investments. Insurance costs will increase. Security investments must grow. The economics of large, centralized export facilities may shift toward distributed infrastructure that presents less attractive targets for enemy attack. There's something profoundly revealing about how vulnerable Russia's energy infrastructure proved, despite being the foundation for Russia's strategic power and economic security. Putin built Russia's post-Soviet recovery on energy exports, invested enormous sums in export infrastructure, and assumed that strategic importance would protect facilities from attack. The Ust-Luga strike proves that assumption catastrophically wrong. In the theater of economic warfare, infrastructure destruction represents the intersection of military capability and strategic impact, where physical destruction creates economic effects that compound over time. Ust-Luga burning sends unmistakable messages about Ukrainian capabilities and Russian vulnerabilities. The revenue that terminal generated funded the war effort. Without that revenue, Russia must find alternative funding or reduce military operations. Here's the third hook. Sometimes in modern conflict, the most decisive victories come not from battlefield engagements, but from destroying enemy economic infrastructure that makes continued military operations financially unsustainable. Ukraine's Ust-Luga strike represents this principle realized through precision targeting that creates strategic effects far exceeding the immediate physical destruction visible in satellite imagery. The operational implications compound daily as Russian oil industry struggles to adapt to Ust-Luga's loss. Every tanker that would have loaded at Ust-Luga must find alternative facilities, or buyers must find alternative suppliers. Every barrel of oil that cannot be exported because loading facilities don't exist reduces revenue and creates pressures throughout Russian oil industry. The cumulative economic impact exceeds the immediate $5.7 billion infrastructure loss because it disrupts an entire export network built around Ust-Luga's capacity. Russian reconstruction efforts face impossible challenges even if funding were unlimited. Rebuilding requires Western components that sanctions restrict, construction must occur while war continues, and Ukrainian drones might strike again. Investment must compete with military spending that Putin prioritizes. The timeline for restoring Ust-Luga's capacity extends years into a future where the war's outcome remains uncertain and reconstruction investments might be wasted if Ukraine continues striking oil infrastructure systematically. And yet, what makes this moment even more remarkable is how it demonstrates Ukraine's strategic maturation. from defensive warfighting to offensive operations targeting Russian economic foundations. Early in the conflict, Ukraine focused necessarily on survival, defending territory and cities from Russian assault. Now, Ukraine strikes deep into Russia at infrastructure, whose destruction impacts Russia's capacity to sustain war economically. The evolution demonstrates sophisticated strategic thinking about how to impose costs that Russia cannot bear indefinitely. Something deeper than infrastructure destruction is unfolding across Russia's burning oil terminal, something that cannot be measured solely in destroyed facilities or lost revenue. It's a fundamental shift in the strategic balance where Ukraine has developed capabilities to strike Russian economic foundations, forcing Russia to defend territory far from Ukrainian borders and protect infrastructure whose vulnerability undermines confidence in Russia's economic resilience. For the first time in this war, Russia faces enemy attacks on strategic economic infrastructure comparable to what Russia has inflicted on Ukraine. The asymmetry that allowed Russia to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure while keeping Russian facilities safe has disappeared. Ukraine can now impose economic costs through infrastructure destruction that Russia cannot prevent and cannot quickly repair. Western security observers feel this shift in their assessments of war trajectory and Russian sustainability. When Ukraine can destroy Russia's largest Baltic oil terminal, it demonstrates capabilities that fundamentally change calculations about how long Russia can sustain military operations if Ukraine systematically targets revenue-generating infrastructure. NATO analysts see vindication of assessments that economic pressure through infrastructure destruction could prove more decisive than military pressure through battlefield engagement. Here's the fourth hook. When your economic infrastructure burns because enemy strikes reach facilities supposedly protected by air defenses, when reconstruction will take years and cost billions you may not have, when every day without that infrastructure costs revenue that funded military operations, you face economic warfare as devastating as any battlefield defeat and potentially more decisive because it threatens the capacity to continue fighting regardless of military will. The lesson is as old as strategic warfare itself, but newly demonstrated through Ust-Luga's destruction. Modern wars are won by nations that can sustain operations economically as much as militarily. Russia cannot sustain war indefinitely if Ukraine systematically destroys infrastructure generating revenue that makes sustained operations financially possible. The terminal burning tonight represents this principle realized through Ukrainian capability to strike Russian economic foundations. This strike, devastating as it is for Russian oil exports, has exposed something profound about energy infrastructure vulnerability and the effectiveness of targeting revenue sources in modern conflict. Ukraine, fighting desperately for survival, has become pioneer in economic warfare through infrastructure destruction, demonstrating that systematic attacks on enemy revenue-generating facilities can create strategic effects that battlefield victories cannot match. And that's what makes this development so powerful beyond its immediate economic impact. Because at its core, this isn't really about one oil terminal or specific export volumes. It's about the fundamental question of whether nations can sustain costly wars when enemies can destroy infrastructure, generating revenue that makes those wars economically possible. Ukraine's answer, delivered through Ust-Luga burning after midnight drone strike, is that they cannot. Russia's burning oil terminal sends a message echoing far beyond energy markets. Economic infrastructure is vulnerable to attack. Revenue sources can be destroyed. Strategic facilities cannot be protected adequately if enemies develop targeting capabilities and accept risks of striking deep inside territory. Ust-Luga's destruction proves these realities definitively. So tonight, as fires burn across $5.7 billion in destroyed oil infrastructure, as Russia loses its primary Baltic export terminal and billions in annual revenue, as Ukrainian drones prove they can reach and destroy critical economic facilities despite air defenses supposedly protecting them, perhaps there's a lesson worth stating clearly. You can build massive energy export infrastructure and depend on it to finance military operations, but you cannot protect that infrastructure from determined enemies who develop capabilities to strike it. You can assume strategic importance makes facilities too valuable to attack, but you cannot prevent attacks when enemies conclude that destroying revenue sources ends wars more effectively than engaging armies in combat. And you can use oil money to fund invasions and occupations, but you cannot hide the reality that the infrastructure generating that money is vulnerable to destruction that eliminates revenue streams for years, forcing choices between financing, reconstruction, or financing continued war that may bankrupt the state regardless of which you prioritize. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.